Thank you so much for having us. My name's Charlie. This is Nick. Thanks for being here. That's really cool. So, look, we're both narrative designers, creative technologists, creative producers, whatever you want to call it. We're all everything these days. And today we're going to talk to you that is actually a little more than just about narrative design for video gaming. This is a game conference, but our main interest is actually in non-linear and interactive storytelling across a whole host of mediums. And so what we're going to do today is talk you through a whole load of content around this topic and a whole bunch of narrative techniques that you can employ and utilize to across mediums to talk about how you can create a story franchise. So that way, hopefully, it can help you with your projects at hand, but also give you a strategy to help maximize your IP. So we tend to, we'll go to the first slide, we tend to think of storytelling in terms of linear progression, going from point A to point B, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Whilst non-linear storytelling may include this kind of progression within a work, it also allows for an audience to branch out and engage with different aspects of the plot or world in an order and pacing of their own choosing. So, however, non-linear storytelling breaks down into two aspects, we believe. The first being the branching plot that I just described, but the second is just as important, if not more, and that second aspect is what we have termed the meta cluster. So let's just break that down for a little bit. In a literary sense, the term meta is used to describe a piece of work that is self-aware in nature. So think Lemony Snicket, who talks straight to the camera in Netflix's A Series of Unfortunate Events, or the narrative framing in Mark Z. Danielski's cult book House of Leaves, or, of course, the subversion of the horror-type genre, the horror trope in the horrifically fun horror movie Cabin in the Woods. Cluster simply means a cluster of stars or a universe. Thus, our meta-cluster is a self-aware universe or body of creative work that is released and presented in a strategic fashion so that you can create the best amount of interest and a true fan. So, moving on to what an interactive story is, let's just quickly jump back to that first model of that first facet of non-linear, branching plots. So let's be clear, look, we're not here to say that every medium or story requires non-linearity throughout that singular work. We're not suggesting that games or films or TV should be chopped up and then accessed in different orders at an audience's own pace. However, in this day and age, creatives and audiences are thinking in terms of franchise. Investors and studios are no longer looking for that good story or that good character. Yeah, sure, that might make a one-off good game, maybe a couple of sequels, a one-off good movie, maybe a couple of sequels. But if you can create a story world, a transmedia franchise, you can produce something that will really sell. And if you can include interactivity within that framework, and this is what we're talking about in terms of interactive storytelling, which actually in simple terms obviously it just means a story that audiences can influence and engage with, whether that's through choices, whether that's through engaging with certain technologies, or even socializing and collaborating with other audience members to affect the outcome of the plot. So an easy example is video games, something online that where everyone experiences the story together, like World of Warcraft, Path of Exile. But there are other interesting and different ways to approach this. So one of those, next slide, is consider this the smartphone narrative app Lifeline. So you receive in real time text messages from an astronaut stranded on a distant planet. The interactivity comes from your ability to direct his actions in surviving in this harsh alien environment. So we'll just show a really quick teaser trailer. Hopefully it will come through for us. Hang on. Hang on. Sorry, we just have to get out of the presentation, I think.
Yeah, how do we do that?
There we go.
Oh, we got something, did we?
Okay, we might just move on because we've got limited time. Sorry, guys. If someone can help us with the next few, be by with this so we can show some video stuff. Someone. Thank you. Sorry? Yeah, they're just links through the internet, but if whoever set up we just have to get out of the presentation and come back into it. Sorry, escape. Great.
Here we go.
Thank you. You win. Who would have thought? So we'll just...
Okay. Where are we? Oh, no. Control click. There we go.
Cool. So I don't know if you guys have played that, but give it a go. It's quite an interesting wee game. So outside of gaming, we can look at the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. That's an American web-based series based off Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It had social media accounts for each of the characters within the shows that would interact with the fans during an ongoing release of episodes. Interactivity is important because it allows the fans to have a sense of ownership of the story, even if they aren't necessarily making drastic changes to the plot. Sorry, mate.
There we go. All right, so moving on, we're going to just look specifically at a few different narrative techniques involved with telling non-linear stories. So these techniques are particularly prevalent in modern gaming, but they have come from a variety of different mediums. Now, I just want to be clear that no one kind of narrative is the right approach. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses. But we would argue that using all of these narratives together in combination with one another is the best approach. It culminates in what we like to call a blended narrative. So the first of these techniques that we're going to look at is the embedded narrative. It's pretty much in every movie you've ever seen. Embedded narrative, it describes a story in which the plot has been pre-written. The audience's experience of the story is defined and limited by what is presented to them, often in a linear fashion. Embedded narrative, it's received quite a bad rap in recent years with the advent of open world gaming and sandbox games, but it is an important technique still to consider. In gaming, this kind of narrative is typified by, although not always, single-player games that have a reliance on cutscenes and in-game cinematics to progress the story forward, and a pre-written story that will either minimally change or not at all change based off the player's interaction with it. So a great example of this would be the emotionally charged Heavy Rain, in which you play as a father looking for his kidnapped son in the carnage of the terrifying origami killer. So in an embedded narrative, the extent of interactivity for an audience member is in the medium of film, making guesses, and the medium of gaming, making decisions about the pre-written world based on story cues. So in a game, there is this obviously added layer of interactivity in which you can test the hypotheses to see if you are correct. But the major downfall of embedded storytelling or embedded narrative is that while they are inherently better at telling a fully strong formatted story in a traditional sense, they do lack a lot of interactivity and only allow minor changes. So the next one is emergent narrative. Now, emergent narrative is pretty much the exact opposite of the embedded narrative. Emergent narrative focuses itself solely on interactivity. Story is created based off an individual's experience with the story world. Now, while the world still requires to be pre-written, story or plot emerges solely from the interaction between the audience member and the game world. Whether that is the system governing a game or props or set pieces in an immersive theater performance. These stories, they're often random, circumstantial. They only ever exist in that state for one person at one time. So the immersive theater outfit Punch Drunk does this incredibly well. Their pieces are entirely emergent, relying on the audience members' interaction with and interpretation of the sets, props, characters to tell the story. Aspects of emergent gameplay can be seen in pretty much every modern game out there at the moment. You think of games like Skyrim, The Witcher 3, Horizon Zero Dawn. However, it is important to note here that the major weakness of emergent narratives outside of their immediate occurrence, on their own, they mean jack shit. They don't mean anything. Nobody cares about the time that you were playing Skyrim and you wandered out into the wilderness and found a bunch of bandits and narrowly avoided death just by hitting the right buttons at the right time. That may have been an exciting adventure for you, but it lacks the emotional context that creates a good story. Next slide. So everyone's probably heard of No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky is pretty much exclusively emergent narrative. They basically go, here's a vast universe with thousands of planets and life forms, go explore, find the center of the universe. So this game flopped, and it flopped pretty badly, to the point in which players were demanding their money back, and the designers were allegedly in hiding. Why? Partly because they didn't deliver on what they promised. They promised this huge immersive space opera-like world and story, but instead they focused on this whole emergent narrative side of things, and the story had no bite. So in my opinion, that's why, or a major reason why that game flopped. So I'm going to hand it back to Charlie now to talk about another.
Cool. So another narrative technique that we use and look at is what we call environmental narrative. So look, this is, it's simply put, it's also sometimes referred to as minimalism, but it uses the literary rule of show, don't tell. Okay, so that is where a narrative is far more potent to a viewer if they're shown a scene or event or a character rather than simply being told about them. Fight Club author Chuck Palahniuk provides a great example for this concept. Instead, he says, instead of waiting for the bus, Mark started to worry about how long the trip would take. He says, a better breakdown would be, the schedule said the bus would come by at noon, but Mark's watch said it was already 11:57. You could see all the way down the road, as far as the mall, and not see a bus. No doubt the driver was parked in some turnaround, the far end of the line, taking a nap. The driver was kicked back asleep and Mark was going to be late. Or worse, the driver was drinking and had pulled up drunk and charged Mark 75 cents for death in a fiery traffic accident. So this technique translates incredibly well to other more visual mediums, film, TV, graphic novels, and games. Visual mediums often fail if they try to tell the audience what's happening instead of showing it. Think of how disconcerting it is when you're watching something and the characters awkwardly stop and explain a lot of information for the audience in a really obvious way. Or how boring it can be when you're waiting to play a video game and you have to read through screeds of information about a fantasy world before you can get to the fun parts and actually understand what's going on. Show, don't tell is the writer's #1 rule, and environmental storytelling riffs off this in a brilliant way. The best example to explain what this technique does is perhaps From Software's cult classic Soul series, which comprises of Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1-3, and Bloodborne. All of these games have vastly expansive mythologies and interesting plot. However, all of this narrative information gets delivered through the environment of the world as opposed to exposition or dialogue. And this particular franchise have created the deepest and truest of fans. In these games, environmental details play an important factor in the development of the story. Items you pick up contain snippets of story in their descriptions. Even the places where you acquired those items tell story. With environmental storytelling, a player may, for example, come across a toppled-over statue amid some ruins, surrounded by rusted shields emblazoned with two different family crests. See, I'm getting into it now. Family crests. From this scene, a player can connect the dots with other snippets of the story. They might know this from item descriptions. They could interpret it to discover that these two families fought in this place for a certain reason. The aging of the rubble might imply how long ago that this battle occurred. And the identity of the toppled statue may have an important part to play in extrapolating that story. So instead of hand-feeding the narrative to an audience, environmental storytelling, much like emergent storytelling, puts the act of engaging with the story in the hands of the audience. Unlike emergent narrative, an environmental narrative is pre-written, often extensively so, but like the emergent, it relies on and rewards the player or viewer for seeking out their own understanding of the story world.
Cool, so now we're just going to look at one final narrative technique before we really get into sort of bringing it all together. This final narrative technique, it's something that underlies all of the other previous narrative structures, but it is sort of worthy of its own segment just because it is essentially the bread and butter of modern day gaming. and that is the ability to make moral choices within a narrative. These choices, they often affect the ultimate outcome of a story's conclusion. So just once again, with all of these techniques, there's an upside and there is a downside. With this technique, the upside's pretty obvious. It allows interactivity, player engagement, that sort of thing. But the downside, it's perhaps a little bit harder to ascertain at first. Really, it all comes down to trust and whether or not our audiences can actually be trusted to tell a story themselves. Now, let's just quickly use an example here, if you want to bring that up. So, Square Enix's 2015 episodic release, Life is Strange, it offered exactly this. They had a game where every decision the player made would affect other things. They would build towards a certain outcome. Now, the game was, for the most part, quite narratively rich, with a well-written story, realistic characters, people that you really felt and cared for. It was... Sorry. Oh, okay, never mind. So it was at the heart of it a coming-of-age tale, and as such it built towards the central character Max, learning about the world around her, growing and maturing into a more well-rounded person. She would essentially come of age. So once we reach the end of this game, the player is presented with a final set of choices that lead to different endings, a good ending and a bad ending. Now the player, and just spoilers here for anyone who hasn't played this game, is given the choice to save her town and let her best friend die, or save her best friend and let the town die. Now this presents a really interesting conundrum within storytelling, because the problem is that if the player chooses to save their friend and kill the town, that moral choice flies in the face of everything that the game has been building towards in the narrative. This is what we call ludonarrative dissonance. Most of you probably are familiar with that term, but for those of you who aren't, it's essentially where gameplay directly contradicts the story elements. There is quite clearly a right ending of Life is Strange. If you watch both endings side by side, you'll see that the ending where she lets her friend die to save the town is definitely what the game designers had in mind when they wrote the story. Max grows up. She realizes that sometimes there's no way to save everyone. Sometimes the hardest decision is the right decision, and you can't make everyone happy. So the emotional weight and punch of this ending is really awesome. It actually almost brought me to tears, and not a lot does that. So it was a strong ending. However, if you choose the other ending, like I said, flies in the face of all the narrative beats leading towards Max growing, learning, changing, becoming a more well-rounded person. Now, there is a second potential pitfall for using multiple choice paths as well. This is essentially the video game version of the film and prose question, does the protagonist get what they deserve? Not what they want, not what they necessarily need, but what they deserve. Now, this question, it always sort of converts down to one about the audience's money. For a fan to feel satisfied, they're always going to ask on a subconscious level, does this ending feel worth the money that I've paid? So you can have a great story, but I mean, if your ending is shit, then that's what you'll be remembered for. So this is an especially volatile problem when the audience can affect the story's outcome, as it may result in a less than satisfying ending, as with the case of Life is Strange if you pick these certain options.
And it's quite a difficult conundrum because we don't want to treat our audience like idiots and not trusting them to make good narrative decisions. That would just sort of come across obviously as condescending and dull, but at the same time it has to be acknowledged that professional writers are, well, for the most part, usually professional writers for a reason. We know how to tell a good story, and as much we have to trust players to make good decisions, players should be able to trust that we as the writers will lead them in the right direction. So another example of some choice-based narrative is from an interactive theatre show that me and some buddies from New Zealand made called The Generation of Z. So we did it in Auckland in 2013, Christchurch 2014. Then we went to Edinburgh. It was a massive hit, and we got invested by the guys from Book of Mormon. It went to London, it's in Korea, it's in China, and it goes to America. It's literally putting people live inside a zombie video game. The Last of Us is what inspired us to make the show, but it was a brilliant example of moral choice. So what happens is you turn up to a space, you're all split up. What's the freakiest thing that can happen when you go to a live event? You get removed from the person that you came with. So we split everyone up, and there are 4 simultaneous storylines with 3 choices in each room. So there were around about 16 to 24 endings for the live show. A lot of the reviews said this is just like being in The Last of Us. This is like being inside every zombie movie I ever loved. And the moral choices were pretty intense. They were always very high stakes. So one of them, you had come through, you'd come through this room. We used a brilliant technique of audience plant, so you didn't know who was real and who wasn't. So in any moment in your group, someone would just get ripped out there, hooked up to a blood punt, eaten, and blood just splurts all over the audience. Or they get their brains blown out with squibs because it had film quality special effects. Now, what happened in one room is you're in this room, something's going on, we've got to get the comms up, come on, let's go. The zombies are coming. And a woman who you just thought was an audience member starts bleeding from her crotch, miscarriage, full blood. So already, I can't tell you how many times in London we had to tell people stop calling 999 because this is part of the show. But what happens is we discover that she's a character. I thought she was audience the whole way through. She's got a partner, she's pregnant, she's been infected, it's a bloodborne virus, and we as the audience have to choose whether we kill her or not in front of her husband. And it was a fascinating social experiment, and something that, even though you go, oh, this is a game conference, what does immersive theater have to do with gaming? And I tell you what, I'm about to explain when we get into VR in a minute, it has everything to do with how you create a piece of virtual reality content. I'm under heavy NDA, but I'm involved with ILM X-Lab, so that's Star Wars Disney put $500 million into a research and development team called ILM X-Lab. It literally, they are banking their entire income streams on the fact that these new technologies are going to completely disrupt the way that they do their business. So their 3 revenue streams are cinema, obviously theme parks, and public spaces activation. So what I've been working on them with is how do we take Star Wars, which is a linear universe, one of the most beloved universes, and adapt them to these non-linear techniques, to these non-linear technologies. And immersive theater is the answer, because interactive theater is everything you learned in film school when creating a piece of virtual reality content, or even AR content, you throw out the window. It is a piece of interactive theater where the camera is the audience. So, look, I've gone on a little bit. We can show the trailer if you want, but I think I've kind of described it, and we're probably running out of time, so it's so good. Returning just slightly back, because that was a bit of a rabbit trail, to the main path, I just want to look at all of this in the context of nonlinear storytelling. So if you remember, nonlinear storytelling is all about giving the audience a degree of control over the story world, giving them interactivity. It's allowing them to approach what they want when they want it. It's also about that meta cluster we talked about, multi-platform, about strategically creating and presenting multiple stories connected to one world as to create a true fan of your work. So what is required of us nonlinear storytellers, game makers, filmmakers, whatever you want to be, is that you need to work with a blended narrative. A blended narrative, it is exactly what you think it might be. It's all of what we've previously discussed, all into one melting pot. Whether you use all of these techniques in your work or only a few, it's completely up to you. What is clear, however, is that for the storytelling of our generation, relying on only one is not an option if you're wanting to build and sell that infamous meta cluster. So look, now that we've got a really solid framework on what to build, we're going to talk a little bit now about how you go about creating a story world, and it begins with the secret sauce, the story Bible. A story Bible is pretty much how it sounds. It is a living, never-ending document of biblical proportions that holds within it all the information surrounding your story world. We're talking an encyclopedia of information that will act as a source document for you and your team that can constantly refer to for those answers to individual stories that you may be creating within your world. A story Bible, being attentive to even the most smallest of details, is crucial in world building. It creates multiple layers of depth, and it builds on the sense of immersion, regardless of the medium. While audiences may not need see beyond what is actually happening in the story they're currently engaging with, having a sense that there's so much more behind the curtain or in the distant mountains, so much more creates that sense of completion to the world of the creation that you've done for them, which will create long-term fans. So what is this Bible, we ask? Probably the most important thing is a timeline. Beginning with your flagship story, be it a film, a game, a graphic novel, that is the center of your timeline. A story Bible will typically detail 50 to 100 years previous and 50 to 100 years afterwards. Creating such a timeline allows you to paint for the audience the past and future of the world and allows for vivid meta-clusters of story. A well-thought-out timeline will resolve any errors of continuity before they even come up, because you will always have this information to refer back to at the very beginning. The Bible will detail things like the geography of the world, politics, religion, societies, cultures, literature, art, biology. Story Bibles can also contain information on the philosophy, metaphysics, fantastical properties of your story world. And elements such as messages, themes, and brand essence can also be included. A story Bible can have as much or as little as you feel is required to formulate your world. Just remember, though, it is a Wikipedia-like document that will never be finished. You will want to refer to it for any questions that you have about a particular narrative, and it is much better to be prepared than not. So, many of you probably think it's a lot like world building, and it is, and this is what has been found in fantasy novels for years. So you've probably heard about J.K. Rowling finishing her final chapter of Harry Potter without even releasing the first book, and her boxes and boxes of extensive notes on the wizarding world, or J.R.R. Tolkien's Distant Mountains theory and his amazing work on creating the Elvish language. The Story Bible is a natural evolution of the world-building technique. A great modern-day example, though, would be Battlestar Galactica, their story Bible, which details the history, religion, culture, society, technology of the 12 colonies and the Cylons, as well as character biographies, series arcs, and storylines, all in one easily accessible place. At the moment, I'm working with a guy called Mark, who is number 2 writer on Battlestar. He's head writer on Ash vs. Evil Dead here in New Zealand at the moment, and amazing hearing him describe what they went through when they were kind of having to deal with, oh my gosh, how are we going to write for this giant thing called Battlestar Galactica? Beginning with a story Bible, if you don't use everything in your published work, it gives your audience the sense that they are engaging with a fully realized world. In terms of Gen Z, we have a very extensive story world and Bible. We got some blood scientists in London to write a whole lot of reports and white papers about the origins of our virus. Could it happen? Yes, they said. That technically, what we were describing could actually happen. Probable? No. But technically, yes. So in terms of our timeline, the live experience is set 3 months after the outbreak. The teen fiction novel is 15 years in the future. The documentary we created is 10 years in the past because the virus came out of an anti-aging drug. So we got a whole documentary that talks about the scientist who came up with that anti-aging drug and how that company became the biggest global company in the world. So there's a whole lot of world that we go through before you even get to, oh my God, I'm in a zombie apocalypse. The video game that we're working on is 2 years after the outbreak. So that gives you a bit of an example. I've talked a little bit about interactive theatre and we're going to get onto VR in a minute, and how that can really help with you. Now, Oculus Story Studio, obviously I'm working on the Exile. All of these virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, creative studios have employed an immersive theatre expert. It is about breaking the fourth wall and that the audience is the camera. The same with Star Wars Land. So, I mean, I can't talk about more than what is in the media, but in the future, we'll talk a little bit about pervasive analytics. But what we're doing is, okay, so these devices are portals. Yep, portals to other worlds. I can put them here and I can be immersed in a world, or I can have this and overlay and have zombies eating all of you. But these devices are also garnering a hell of a lot of information about who I am as an individual. It knows how I walk, it knows my blood temperature, it knows whether I'm a male or a female in some cases. So all of a sudden, these devices can be creating a digital persona of who you are to deliver you the narrative at the very best moment for you on that particular day. It's very, very interesting. You've read all about what's going on with Facebook, emerging the mind, and all this stuff. Now, yes, that's mind control computing, but what we're talking about is it's analyzing you. Think about that for advertising. Oh my God, the ethics involved with pervasive advertising. But Star Wars Land in the sense of, so if you're playing the Millennium Falcon, you crash it, it knows, because everything has an algorithm, there's a whole lot of data on the individual. So when you go into the bar and get your drink, someone will say to you, why'd you crash the Millennium Falcon, you idiot? So it knows, it follows, the narrative is following you around. So it's a pretty exciting, brave new world out there. We're just going to jump into VR now. Look, I could open a whole kettle of fish about how, in terms of writing for VR, but if you want to, there's a free resource I was part of. It's called it's an international group of writers. It's called the VR Writers Room. It was myself, Jeff Gomez, Rihanna Pratchett, who writes Tomb Raider. BAFTA commissioned us to write a white paper. It's through Digital Jam. It's called VR Writing for VR something. It's online. So if you want to know more about that, but Nick will tell you now.
Cool. Okay, so hang on, where are we? Here we go. So with all of that in mind, we're going to jump into VR. So first off, we need to be clear, we're not experts in VR.
No one is.
Yeah, pretty much no one is. It's too new of a technology. So there's lots of ideas around how to write for this platform, and we do have a few of our own, but they're all just ideas that may work in one given time and not in another. So take it with a grain of salt. But what makes VR so different is that with other mediums, you're dealing with squares. So with, say, like a film or a traditional video game, the audience is presented with this frame, and then this frame, and then this frame as a way to tell the story. With VR, you need to consider it in terms of, like Charlie said, the audience is the camera, and you're standing inside a sphere. So you can look around and see everything at any given point in time, and that presents with its a whole bunch of different issues, such as the audience may miss an important plot point because they're over there looking at the wall. So we're just going to go through a couple of issues that we've come across and try and answer them. So just give me 1 second. Right, so with VR, narrative designers need to be working really closely with programmers and game designers and all of you guys out there because it all comes down to the way that we present a scene and direct audience attention. For example, many of you may have heard this before, we need to think about sound and lighting. Essentially, we have to convince the audience in VR more than in any other medium to look at characters and events. Having surround sound and directed lighting is a really good way to do this, just by creating audio and visual cues. So, for example, like I said, the player might be looking over at that wall over there and almost completely miss something, but if you bring a sound from this direction, then it sort of encourages them to turn and look what's going on over here. Or you can put lighting over like a particular door, like the exit door up there, and that automatically draws attention. Another way of directing audience attention through a VR experience is through architecture. So if you think about a mall, it's all designed to direct you through the building in the best possible way for you to purchase as much as possible. So if we can sort of look into architecture and the way that this is done, then we can sort of start designing levels in a similar way so that the audience feels like they're making their own decisions and going through at their own pace, looking at what they want, but really they're actually being directed. So the second major issue that is being faced by storytellers in VR at the moment is the dreaded VR sickness. Moving in VR can cause audiences to upchuck, hurl, whatever you want to call it, just because there is this sort of disconnect between what your eyes are telling you, what your body's telling you, and then your brain's interpretation of it all. So that presents a really big problem at the moment, but it does seem to be more of an issue with the technology, and that seems to be getting fixed pretty quickly. So hopefully we won't have to deal with that for much longer. But for example, me and Charlie, we're working on a VR experience at the moment. It's a horror game, and so we initially were like, right, so at this point we want the monster to chase the player. And our programmers went, nope, can't do that. And we went, why not? And they're like, well, if they run, then they're going to feel sick. Or if the monster grabs them and chucks them around, then they're not being chucked around in real life, so they're going to feel sick. So we had to think about other ways to present the same sort of suspense and fear that you would find in a traditional horror game. We're still working on it, so it's still sort of up in the air. But we've thought about things like encouraging the player to hide from the monster more than actually run from it, or even just having short running moments so that we can sort of get it out of the way really quickly. And also things like slowing down what's happening around the player while they're moving fast so that it's not as disconcerting. So moving on, let's just look quickly at the things that we do know and have found to work. So the first is transitional phases. So with VR, it obviously offers a depth of immersion that we haven't really seen before. We're able to present drama and character-driven narrative within immersive entertainment with an immediacy to it that other mediums need hours to develop. So with transitional phases, it's all about having like an entry point to the game, a point prior to the player going into the experience. Sort of like a menu sequence in traditional games. We have data from various different sources that have shown that this transitional phase is incredibly important in creating an immersive experience because it allows the audience mental breathing room to prepare to suspend their disbelief. It's basically like a crossing of the threshold, an entering of a waiting lobby, or like the curtain rising at the start of a piece of theatre. So when audiences get immersed into a constant state of empathy like they are in VR, it also requires a constant level of alertness and consciousness of their environment. So because of that, there's also a need to balance, there needs to be a balance which allows players to mentally relax. And so that's where safe zones come in. So moments where not a lot's happening and they can just sort of chill out. So one of the coolest things about virtual reality is the ability to create true empathy. To create genuinely engaging experiences, we need to get beyond like a generic environment and universe creation. With so many experiences focused on painting broad canvas pictures, complete with genre tropes, it's crucial that we remember empathy in VR is formed through the medium's capability of intensifying through direct presence our personal connection with individual characters. So, for example, who here has played Henry on VR? Anyone? 1, 2, a couple of years. So Henry does a really good job at this. It's basically it's a kid's VR, but it's about a hedgehog on his birthday, and he's got no friends essentially. And they have this hedgehog just sort of connect with you through eye contact constantly. And that's a really good way to develop empathy because that's how we develop empathy for one another in real life. So you actually sort of feel for this character while you're involved in this experience. So lastly, I just want to conclude on VR with a little bit about audience agency. Audiences within immersive entertainment have the potential to impact their virtual universe. The ability to create a series of lasting changes in the story world, particularly in the form of character drama, will generate this level of intimacy that we've been talking about that will actually become the signifying feature of virtual reality. Having the agency to explore and influence outcomes enhances the audience's sense of immersion and will create impact and influence between different platforms. So, for example, a game that I'm working on at the moment with some guys in Kansas City, Orbis VR. Now, it's an MMORPG in virtual reality. So we've been working on this idea of a living, breathing narrative. And it's a really difficult idea to deal with because having like a player or a group of players affect something in a long-lasting way within the story world, it creates all sorts of issues. Yep, cool, nearly done. And it sort of means that the writer has to constantly maintain and rewrite so that new players get the same experience or just as good of an experience as older players. So we just had a couple of examples there which we won't show because obviously we've run out of time, but I'll just hand it over to Charlie to sort of finish.
I think I've used it all up, but look, future, what is in the future? Big data-driven AI narrative coming massively. Think AI-driven Dungeon Master. We talked about pervasive analytics coming, mind control coming, contact lens technology coming, AR mixed reality glasses this big coming. So think about that, but do not ever not think about story, because no matter how good the game is, no matter how good the graphics are, no matter how good the technology is, no one will truly care unless I care about the story. Kia ora.